Imagine a landscape completely hostile to life, a violent expanse of volcanic rock and dust. You wouldn't expect a place like this to birth global trade networks, influence the foundational theories of modern biology, or produce elite athletes capable of competing with the world's largest nations. Yet, situated 500 kilometers off the coast of Senegal, with no other landmass in sight, sits the island nation of Cape Verde, 10 isolated pieces of rock scattered across the Atlantic Ocean. Despite that extreme geographic isolation, the nation commands a fierce presence on the world stage. The national football team, known as the Blue Sharks, has held their own against global powerhouses in recent World Cup qualifiers, showing incredible tactical discipline. To understand how this tiny, arid archipelago generates such outsized influence today, we have to look back to a time when these islands were entirely devoid of human life. In the year 1456, Portuguese navigators sailing off the western coast of Africa stumbled upon these 10 islands. What they found was absolute emptiness. There were no indigenous populations, no native civilizations, and barely any vegetation, just miles of dark stone baking under the Atlantic sun. The colonizers named their discovery Cabo Verde, or Green Cape. It was a glaring irony, borrowing the name from a lush peninsula back on the Senegalese mainland to describe an environment that was hypersaline and practically devoid of fresh water. But the Portuguese Empire saw an opportunity. They claimed this uninhabited void and began laying the stone foundations for what would become the very first European settlement in the tropics. Because of its extreme isolation, with no local population to resist them, Cape Verde became a blank slate, a perfectly isolated laboratory for a new model of global empire. By the 16th century, that colonial experiment reached its geopolitical peak. The islands were transformed into the central nerve center for the Portuguese transatlantic slave trade, acting as a mandatory waypoint between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. The forced convergence of enslaved Africans and European colonists on these isolated rocks created a distinct demographic reality. Over generations, a unique Creole culture and language emerged from this mixing of people. The islands became so vital and well-traveled by European ships that the HMS Beagle made its very first stop here in 1832, bringing a young scientist named Charles Darwin to its shores. Darwin spent 3 weeks surveying the terrain. His observations of the region's volcanic geology and the adaptation of its species helped form the first building blocks of his theory of natural selection. Yet, a fatal geographic flaw sat beneath the empire's operation. The massive wealth passing through these hypersaline evaporation ponds and barren ports was built entirely on trade routing. The land itself remained inherently hostile, yielding almost zero natural resources to actually sustain human life. An empire built purely on the convenience of a geographic location is fragile. The moment global trade routes shift, the foundation fractures. As the global slave trade was gradually abolished in the 19th century, the Portuguese Empire's interest in maintaining the archipelago evaporated. Without the constant flow of imperial capital, the harsh environmental reality took over. Severe, recurring droughts struck the neglected islands, decimating what little agriculture existed and plunging the population into starvation. Faced with absolute famine, hundreds of thousands of Cape Verdeans fled. A mass exodus began as citizens sought survival in the United States, Europe, and other parts of Africa. For those who stayed behind, desperation turned into resistance. They launched a bitter, armed struggle against the remnants of Portuguese colonial control. After years of conflict and a changing political climate in Lisbon, the Portuguese completely withdrew. On July 5, 1975, Cape Verde officially won its independence. The colonizers left behind a nation where only 10% of the land was arable. The general expectation was that the newly independent society would simply perish in the dust. That collapse never happened. Instead, Cape Verde defied the geographic odds to become one of the most politically stable, corruption-free democracies on the African continent today. This animated diagram illustrates an astonishing demographic reality. While the domestic population sits at around 530,000, the global diaspora of Cape Verdeans living abroad has expanded to over 1 million people. This vast, invisible empire of immigrants forms the backbone of the modern economy. Every year, they send a massive influx of foreign remittances back to their families, providing the critical capital needed to keep the domestic markets afloat. On the islands themselves, citizens combat the steep volcanic geography through extreme agricultural adaptation. They carve elaborate networks of terraced farming directly into the rock, forcing crops to grow where flat land is non-existent. Ultimately, the resilience of the Cape Verdean people proved more vital to the nation's survival than any mineral or agricultural output of the volcanic soil. That exported population allows this tiny nation to project immense cultural power. The melancholic traditional music of native singers like Cesaria Evora has reached a world-renowned status, echoing the history of longing and departure that defines the islands. This genetic legacy extends to the highest levels of professional football. Megastar Cristiano Ronaldo traces a portion of his family roots back to the Cape Verdean island of São Vicente, where his great-grandmother was born. And returning to the Blue Sharks national team, their repeated success in international tournaments proves that a nation's physical size on a map has little correlation to its strength on the world stage. Yet, despite this global footprint, the heart of the country remains tied to a stark physical reality. Among the dark volcanic peaks and active craters, citizens stubbornly continue to build homes, cultivate crops, and extract life from the harsh environment. The story of Cape Verde shows that when an empire abandons a barren rock, the future belongs to the survivors who stayed to turn